I read about how the pet cemetery is going under and that all the pets are going to be exhumed. My first cameraman told me I didn't know how to shoot this kind of thing, and he did. At one point, I pushed him into a partially exhumed dog grave.
Welcome, everyone, back to another edition of Let's Take 5, the podcast where we take a great out of cinema and discuss their excellence and range. My name is Eric Martindale.
My name is Austin Luger.
Today we are continuing on with our Errol Morris 5. The previous films we covered were Gates of Heaven, A Thin Blue Line. Last week we covered A Brief History of Time. And today we are going to discuss The Fog of War before moving on to Tabloid. Fog of War was the 2005 winner, I believe, at the Academy Awards for Best Documentary. It follows the life of Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy, and then subsequently under Lyndon B. Johnson once Kennedy was assassinated. The film takes us through Robert McNamara's early life, early World War I days, well, specifically the victory of World War I and his memories of that, then taking him through when he served as kind of like a civilian military consultant during World War II, which he worked with the generals in that, and then eventually into Vietnam. Well, that is the tertiary look at it.
That is when you press info on the cable. That's what this is about.
Yeah, when you press info on the cable, and then ultimately, of course, the film gets into this idea of the Fog of War, which we'll get into later. Throughout the film, we are delivered 11 lessons regarding war, so like an update to Sun Tzu's Art of War, which I think is kind of what may be happening here.
I think so.
The 11 rules for war as it is today. And these are guidelines that you should follow based on Robert McNamara, and also things you should expect. So they're both philosophy, like war philosophy, and also war theory, and how you should practice if you're going to engage in war. And it ultimately ends up being kind of a weird character study about Robert McNamara accidentally.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say off the very beginning of the podcast, Vietnam is the war I must know the least about, which is so strange because, like, I've obviously lots of movies about the topic, but all those movies are really about the feeling and themes and anger and confusion people had during that time. I don't know a ton about, like, the steps. Mm-hmm. So when I was watching this film, and as they're going towards these steps, it was hard for me to, like, sometimes trust him or, like, believe him because I didn't have enough reference to, like, go back. But I found this movie was just so amazing because it is this subject, this really complicated subject, who is being very open. Not completely, but, like...
He doesn't like to get personal.
Does not want to talk about his family. Does not talk about his family, especially during kind of the protest and criticism of him.
He does lead on that he thinks that it may have resulted in his wife's death, and a kind of throwaway line.
Yes, which was haunting.
Yeah.
And this movie, because when people see him as a complete villain, as one of the ones who kind of led to this unnecessary and violent war, I think this movie also does act as closure, in a way. Understanding. I don't think he's like a hero in this movie, but much like in a previous movie we covered, Grizzly Man, this is a very particular relationship between documentarian and subject.
Yes. Where
it is not just a puff piece or a slam. It is getting into a mind of someone that you have doubts about, and you come out the other end. I found my opinion on Robert McNamara shifting and kind of obscuring throughout the entire film. Early in the film, I was prepared to not like him quite flatly, and then as the film went on, I started to feel like I understood him more, and through my understanding of him, I started to feel very sorry for him. That was the transition I made. Because here's the reality, I think that, like, you know, people... There's two things about this film, first of all, that you just have to understand, is that any opinion we have on the war, and any opinion Robert McNamara has on the war, and this is stated in the film, is hindsight.
We're
Yes.
talking about war after it happens. Like, and this is why, and we've commented on this before, is like we don't like television shows or other media where it basically goes back to that period in time and then has an opinion on that period of time because it's not actually fair. Like the newsroom.
Right. Where it's not that you go back in time and see the opinions.
It's set in that
It's
time.
that you have 2018 opinions that you're putting into 1970s mouths, whereas they had opinions there.
You're right.
You know, like there's an unfair critique.
And those opinions are the ones that led and informed the decisions they're making in those present times. That's why they're so important to be talked about.
Yeah.
And then the other big thing I got out of it, or as I was going through, is I started to not care whether or not this was, whether he was, this is too harsh a word, but whether he was lying. I stopped caring about whether he was or not.
Okay.
Because I got to a point where I understood that this was, for better or worse, at this point in time, this was his story. This is his truth. This is what he believes.
And that's what makes this movie so incredible, because even though it seems like such an easy gimmick to do, there are no more interviews in this movie.
No.
There are no other talking heads. There are no points of reference. It is him. It is footage. And also, in a bit of out of character, Errol Morris's voice.
Mm-hmm. Which I liked, because that creates this narrative of a conversation that's happening between the two.
Absolutely, especially since the first lines of the movie, which I think was very entertaining, and weirdly put me on McNamara's side for the first 30 seconds, which is clearly in the middle of a talk, but he goes, "Oh, don't worry, I remember the exact sentence I was on. I can get you right back to the sentence I was at. We can just, you do your editing thing,
Yeah.
but I know the exact word I'm on." And a word that, is delightfully, egotistical.
Well, he's very egotistical.
But there's something also about it where, he's not a stupid person.
No,
The
he's a
fact-
brilliant person. Yeah. I don't think that's arguable.
But when you look at other people you disagree with, you go, "Oh, it's a
He's a
person."
moron.
Yeah, but this is someone where he knows all these facts off the top of his head, and but even the facts that are painful or against his side. Near the end, he knows exactly at what month how many people had died in the war, how many Americans had died in the war, and there is something about a complete wide understanding that he has that makes him such a fascinating subject, and still able to be critiqued for his decisions and actions.
And disagreed with on even his hindsight.
Yes. And that is such a curious element of the film, because especially when, as the film's wrapping up, we're trying to understand the idea of blame, and he still won't take it, necessarily. And I found that to be a very, fascinating thing, because
Well, good God, you have him on tape in the film, though, telling LBJ,
yeah.
dude, this isn't working.
Yes.
This isn't working. And LBJ's, quite frankly, having a mentality, a bullheaded mentality that he, by God, was not going to be the first president to lose a war.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't going to happen. We're going to knock the hell out of him.
Yeah.
It's not happening.
Yeah, and it was that, and
I guess where I ended up with,
right.
I don't blame him for Vietnam. I don't end up there. I don't. Maybe of the people that were at the time of this documentary that were still alive, he certainly probably has the most blame. But again, we're assigning blame 40 years later, 50 years later,
which goes into the closure element, right?
Yeah.
You just want one of the most dividing elements of American history, of people, and the repercussions still exist, not only internationally but still within our culture. It was it was a really big time of not trusting the government, and not trusting the government's decisions for our troops and their safety.
And we see shots and different shots, and we see different things happening where we actually observe. We observe him lying to the American people. We see that happening. And we know that they're alive because McNamara is telling us. He's telling us now the truth. So when it cuts back to this footage from the 1960s and he's in front of the TV cameras and he's saying stuff, McNamara, by his own admission, is telling us he lied. He's lying.
Yes.
He was... I mean, if you're being very generous, misleading the American people for sure.
And there was something, I mean, like, and that is true, and again, that is something that's very rewarding to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because when you keep saying that everyone's lying and you don't like have an admission, you just feel crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Modern day, but but what's something I thought was so interesting here was also like, and he doesn't like overstate this, but like when you are at that position, when you are that high up and you have that clearance, there is just so much more you know,
mm-hmm.
and in many ways it feels very easy to be, someone just watching the news and thinking like, oh, this is how it should be done, and like there's a couple of like pieces in the film where like I thought like. It's always amazing what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you talk about Cuba. It's like, we were fine with Cuba. Like, it was all good. Like, with Russia. And you hear Morse go, yeah, but they tried to invade us.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, the Bay of Pigs. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess
like,
I'm talking about that.
And, like, whereas, like, that is such a, like, major, like, history chapter
mm-hmm.
of this time. And he, who is so focused on the Cold War, and so, like, this is the driving decision for so many things, to have him go like, okay, yeah, but don't look at that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not as important as you think it is.
Because I know what's
I know more.
And he references, he references a ton of shit, but in that same section, he ends up talking about how close we were to annihilation, and this isn't just somebody talking. This is the Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And he's telling us that if it weren't for Khrushchev and Kennedy, so basically two of the three leaders,
mm-hmm.
you just needed one more to be okay with nuclear war, because Castro was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Castro tells him personally to his face later that he says, I was willing to sacrifice Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
I told him to nuke you. I mean, that was what it was. And then we find out that they had something like 130 nuclear weapons there. Like way more than
mm-hmm.
they had thought. And at that time, they were talking about a loss of life reaching 70 million in
mm-hmm.
the U.S. I mean, 70 million. Back in 1963 or 4?
Yeah.
No, 1962. I don't know. Kennedy was assassinated in 63, so that could have been then. It was 64. But regardless, just like it's crazy. It really is crazy. They say this, he looked down the barrel of nuclear annihilation, and it almost seemed like we got more lucky
mm-hmm.
than cooler heads sort of prevailing.
Right. And there's
We're
something...
talking about the annihilation.
Right.
You know? Like
it's
that,
terrifying.
You know.
And there's something about the way they kind of look at this guy in a linear fashion. I mean, you're looking at him, look at the two world wars,
mm-hmm.
and kind of what that looked like on a global landscape, but also from an American victory response
mm-hmm.
in a way. And the way you kind of get from that to his time with Kennedy really gives you the sense that he is for America, which is something that seems very obvious. But when you like look at like, again, here I am just being an armchair response to these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But like so much of the critiques of like Cheney and Rumsfeld is that they were kind of using Americana towards a different kind of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like it's war hawking towards other means. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and that's a lot of people perceive of them. Again, they know more than we knew, but it's still able to critique. Like,
but you can still apply those principles, those 11 lessons, to the same type of shit.
Yes.
For instance, sometimes seeing isn't believing, and believing isn't seeing, or whatever that lesson
mm-hmm.
is in regards to the facts of what actually is going on. We never found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Correct.
So...
And we looked.
And we looked. You know, because and we sure as hell thought they were there.
Yes.
But they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can say Bush was lying. I don't think Bush was lying, and here's why. Because we go there, he wants to find them. Because if we don't find them, that is a fucking PR nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
And it was.
Mission accomplished.
You know, because if we go there and we find weapons of mass destruction, and we actually see that there was intent to use these on
mm-hmm.
us, then we're not talking about the Iraq War being a mistake.
Correct.
And everyone now agrees. I mean, 99%. Hell, Donald Trump agrees, or at least we think he does. He says he does. whatever the wind's blowing that day.
Yes. We are recording this a week early, so we have no idea what he said in the past 7 days.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what he's tweeting about right now, but he, that the Iraq War was a mistake.
Yes.
And when these people voted to go to war, Democrats and Republicans alike, they voted to war based on intelligence that wasn't accurate.
Absolutely.
And then you find out there are so many decisions like that made all the time in war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, absolutely all the time. And, wow.
And there's these are the same kind of decisions. They weren't as, blatant as this is there and it wasn't there with Vietnam, but you're seeing them look at an incredibly dangerous area escalating beyond control.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so curious to, have him believe in the, idea of beginning this. But yet really, there's a point when, Errol Morris in the movie wanted to start talking about Vietnam, and it was to go back and talk about World War II a little bit longer.
Yeah.
That part,
there's some unfinished business here.
Yeah.
But they all flow into each other.
They do, and it's an insanely well-edited movie.
Right.
But there's something about him also, wanting to stall towards the shameful parts of his tenure.
Yeah, he wants to... Well, see, it's weird. I didn't see it that way. I almost saw it with, in order for you to understand what is coming, you need to know these facts.
Mm-hmm.
Because World War War I creates World War II.
Mm-hmm.
World War II creates the Cold War. The
Mm-hmm.
Cold War creates Vietnam by
Mm-hmm.
extension, because the news reports were calling them... Well, there's this many American deaths and no report on how many communist deaths. I mean, they're referring to the Vietnamese as the communists.
Right.
So, the North Vietnamese. So, it's kind of like a weird... I don't know.
It was billed as endangering the American way of life when they were never going to reach our shores.
No.
Yeah.
And that's, again, goes into one of his lessons of war. Actually, be willing to reevaluate, your goals and your positions. And a lot of those rules come up as a means of evaluating, being able to evaluate whether you should be having the war to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big thing, too. Because what we find out, there's no reason we were at war in Vietnam. What they thought they were fighting for didn't match what we thought they were fighting for. Mm-hmm. It was literally this whole thing is a mistake.
Yes,
it's a mistake on so many levels. And again, I don't really blame McNamara for it, because we have the advantage of hindsight, and that, in essence, is the fog of war that they're talking about, right?
It is, but it's also it's depicted as this anxious spiral that, while those higher up couldn't see a way out. When Errol Morris brings up the gases that were used, it's sometimes you really see McNamara stutter, where he's like, "Well, I don't know what exact gases we used on the people, but if we did have those kind of gases, we were in the right to do so. I'm not sure which gases they were." I'm like, oh boy,
yeah.
You've had nightmares about this.
Well, and also that's the thing. It's there's this juggle McNamara has versus being. I mean, a war is stats, right?
Yeah.
How many of them are we killing versus how many are they killing of us? Because war is about killing people. That's what it is, to achieve a goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And usually that's what it is. So, or that's how war is played, rather. And there's this weird version of McNamara you get when you're talking about just the facts, which are well, this many people are being lost on this mission, but we're accomplishing this much from doing this mission.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, this mission is a win. And then weighing those obstacles again versus those statistics back and forth about how this is not a win. We shouldn't be doing this because we're not killing enough of them versus how many we're losing. So statistically speaking, this is a bad idea.
Right.
Versus the individual aspect where he talks about a certain person's death or this person's death or this person's death, and you see him get emotional.
Yes.
Because it enters the human aspect, the side of it, when we're not just referring to, 50% of Tokyo was burned to death. When I say this person died, that's sad.
Yes.
And he gets emotional. He cries several times, or starts to cry several times in this film, while we also see him be very, very, as a matter of fact, about mass killing.
And I think one of the greatest moments of the movie for me is when he talks about that Quaker protester.
Mm-hmm.
And because, I mean, still, like, you see so many, like, major war protests.
He knows the guy's name.
He knows the guy's name. He's so affected by this man. Right? He burned and, like...
Burned himself.
To
protest Vietnam right underneath his office window.
Right. And
was trying to do it with his child, but then tossed his child
yeah.
away at the last second.
That is something where, I mean, so many protests from Vietnam on, like, you just get such a quick government dismissal on, like, this the idea of protesting, like, hey, support the troops kind of thing. Again, in a very closure way, it was so haunting and yet rewarding to see, like, they notice.
Mm-hmm.
They notice, and this is a violent, horrible thing. Do not do this. This is a really graphic way that
he knows the guy's name. He knows why he was there. He knows the child's name. He knows how old that child is now.
Right, and he knows the child's still alive too, which means he's kind of keeping tabs and whatnot. There's something about you're not locking yourself into an angry bubble where anyone who disagrees with you is wrong and is against America. You know what I mean? Like, this is someone who is affected by every aspect of what's going on.
And you hit the nail on the head there, someone. Mm-hmm. So that's where I am at the end of the film with him. This guy, this someone, this human being had this unbelievable responsibility that someone has to have, but no one should really have.
Right.
And it at the end of the day, I have nothing but to feel sorry for him because I think that, I mean, that was his job. Was he good at his job? That's debatable.
Well, and he makes it even harder in that kind of examination because near the end he said, like, if not you, who is to blame? It's ultimately the president's decision.
Yeah.
So as he's still feeling insane weight on his shoulders, he's saying
more.
There's one that's more. And that, is, to me, is still just it's the worst job in the world.
Yeah.
There's no worse job than the leader of the free world.
I agree. I'm with you.
And you always want someone to kind of recognize that power and the haunting elements it has. Modern day. So...
it's the elephant in the room, though, right? I mean...
It absolutely is, especially as we're...
I understand, like, this isn't a political podcast, but it is... The movie is political.
It is very much political, and
war is politics. I mean, it's like it is.
It's so curious with Vietnam and the war in Iraq that really kind of shaped the way that people and journalists and even politicians could talk about if we're ever in a prologue of war, what the discussion is. Like right now, there's so much like tension going on because we just don't know what's going to happen with North Korea or Iran, and like we're all just afraid to talk about like. Oh God! Like it's.
And once the first shots fired, this movie would teach you. Once that happens, and the escalation is very, very quick, and people start living and dying based on your decisions that you're having to make amongst all this confusion. And the end result is ultimately the worth of the end result is ultimately not going to be able to be judged until long after that conflict's over.
Right.
Because we, even the people that are giving their opinions in the day-to-day news cycle, their opinions are not informed by actual facts because nobody knows what those are.
Sure.
No one knows what those are until it's said and done. That's the facts. That is the facts. I mean, they talk about using the atomic bomb and Truman's decision to use that here. And the proportionality meeting the standard. Like, why? Why drop the bomb when we're burnt, when all of Japan's on fire? But then you got to weigh that cost of putting American troops on Japan. Well, what if it escalates to that point? And this idea of preemptive evil to ultimately achieve a greater good, which is literally stated in the film. It's like how are these decisions made by people in the moment? They have to be made. They just have, because they have to be. And then in the end, we're stuck years down the line picking up the pieces, looking back and saying, "Oh, that was bad. This was a bad idea. This was a good one. This was a bad one. This is a good one." And I'm not saying it's unfair criticism, because criticism is ultimately warranted. I'm just saying that I feel sorry for the people getting criticized, if that makes sense.
It does, especially when you look at McNamara, and I think one of his last lessons about human nature is inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think even McNamara would agree that because the stakes are so unbelievably high, you would always want a greater man than you in the room. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, you want just the smartest person imaginable. And even though McNamara is still such an incredibly flawed individual that will forever be in America's history books, it says something, at least, that you can have a 2-hour movie entirely just talking to him, and it's so cinematic it won the Oscar.
I could have gone another hour.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean,
and that is insane. And
I couldn't take my eyes off it.
And you kind of want, like, if anyone is able to make a decision this big, if you can do this, that means something. That we need someone who's seen every perspective. And
you're never going to find that person.
Yeah, I know.
That's what's freaky. But I mean, you hope to. I mean, I was haunted by the opening of the film. Is what I keep going back to, when he says the first thing you have to accept when you're taking military command is that you are going to make mistakes that cost lives. Sometimes these mistakes will cost 1 life. Sometimes they cost 100. Sometimes they cost 1,000. And there have been mistakes that have cost 100,000 lives. That has happened.
And that's something I can't do. Like,
exactly.
Like, there's a certain kind of person who is able to live with themselves and still be a person. And I think that's like what you kind of get at McNamara. Again, you can very much still hate him for his politics and decisions, but like,
there's humanity there.
Yeah, he's not a robot. And I'm so curious, and I'll try to watch it before the wrap up, but like, one of the 2 Immortals films I haven't seen is The Unknown Known, where he essentially tries to do this with Rumsfeld. Mm-hmm. And every review I saw said he wasn't McNamara. Like, he didn't get that level of like closure and self-reflection that McNamara had about Vietnam. So I'm so curious to watch it. But it seemed like Rumsfeld was much more defensive and not going to give.
Also, as polarizing as the war in Iraq is and was, it never reaches the fervor of Vietnam. I mean, I wasn't even alive at that time.
Yeah.
But it's like Vietnam was. I mean, that is one of, like, if you're writing down the 10 worst things to happen in America, that might make the list. You know what I mean?
It means something that even when we weren't alive then, the phrase Vietnam protests rolls off the tongue so easily, whereas Iraq protests don't. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a historical expert. I think we're still in shock as a country. I feel like only the past like few years we were really out of the shock of 9/11. I feel like we've become a different country again. Yeah. So yeah, this movie is really good.
It's honestly, it's one of the better movies I think we've covered on the podcast.
Yeah, and
it's so good. I mean,
it's one that I kind of want to always revisit like every 5-10 years.
Yeah, well, good luck. You need a streaming service, because I was trying to buy the movie afterwards on DVD and I couldn't find it.
I wonder if they're having a new edition coming. I would hope so.
The DVD is $45.
That's insane. But anyway, that is the Fog of War. You might be able to rent it streaming wise. We highly recommend that you do. We'll be back next week with we're getting on a lighter note, as Errol Morris returned full force into his quirky behavior with an absolutely bonkers movie called Tabloid. I don't always say this, but because we always spoil the whole movie, watch Tabloid before the episode. It's going to get weird in ways that not even the trailer will expect make you prepared for. Until then, you can leave us a review on iTunes. Really appreciate it. You can go to theartofmore.com, where you can see all the episodes of this show and other podcasts like The Immortals, which this week reviewed our first Francois Truffaut film, Day for Night, the delightful movie about movies. And we did the TV show Strange with Candy. And music, I forgot to write down, that we covered. So check that out. Also, Adam Stern will have new episodes this summer that I'm very excited about listening to. Where can we find you, Eric?
Yeah, you can find me at Constant Diversion. That's my YouTube channel, so look me up on there.
I want to do a 60-second video game talk, because you mentioned to me before I watch this again that McNamara is in one of your all-time favorite video games.
Yeah, he's
Can you give us the context of this?
Yes, he's not given by name, but he's in Metal Gear Solid 3, which is set in 1964 during the Cold War, and there's basically a hostile Russian takeover in a period in an area of Russia by GRU soldiers, and an operative goes in and diffuses the situation. Shenanigans ensue. Anyway, he arrives back to receive his medal, and there's a LBJ. This is in the Oval Office. He receives the medal for LBJ, and the first man to walk up and shake his hand is this skinny, black-haired guy with wide-frame glasses. And immediately when I saw McNamara as the young McNamara in this film, I went, "Oh shit, he's in Metal Gear Solid 3."
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't have a line. I mean, he just shakes the main character's hand, but you have, it's funny, you have LBJ there and Khrushchev are both characters in the game, so it's interesting.
And to tie it all together...
The voice actor who played LBJ sounds exactly like him.
Oh, really? And tied all together, the lead of the Metal Gear Solid franchise is an eye patch-wearing hero named Snake. Latest episode of Ad Absurdum is Escape from New York, starring an eye patch-wearing hero named Snake Plissken.
Who may have been an inspiration.
Maybe, I'm not sure. So check out all of those things. We recommend that you do. Until then, we'll be back next week with Tabloid. My name's Austin Migger.
My name's Eric Martindale.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
We all make mistakes. We know we make mistakes. I don't know any military commander who is honest, who would say he has not made a mistake. There's a wonderful phrase, the fog of war. What the fog of war means is, war is so complex, it's beyond the ability of the human mind to comprehend all the variables. Our judgment, our understanding are not adequate. And we kill people unnecessarily. Wilson said, "We won the war to end all wars." I'm not so naive or simplistic to believe we can eliminate war. We're not going to change human nature anytime soon. It isn't that we aren't rational. We are rational. But reason has limits. There's a quote from T.S. Eliot that I just love. "We shall not cease from exploring, and at the end of our exploration, we will return to where we started and know the place for the first time." Now, that's, in a sense, where I'm beginning to be.